Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa and I'm from the Microsoft Data Journalism program, which is a program that teaches journalists how to use Power BI to create compelling and interactive data visualizations. I'm joined here today with Matthew from Microsoft Research, and we're going to tell you about Timeline Storyteller, which is a brand new custom visual for Microsoft Power BI, available for download in the Office store, that enables journalists or anybody interested in telling a data story how to create an interactive timeline. Now, many of you may be familiar with Power BI as a business intelligence tool that only analysts use. But the reality is, Power BI can help just about anybody tell a story with data. And for the past year and a half, we've been leaning in on an effort to support journalists create these stunning, interactive, beautiful visualizations that enable readers to really tap into the data and explore the stories most relevant to them. We know that this demand for interactive visualizations is there, but we hear constantly from newsrooms that they don't have the time, the resources, the skill sets, or access to tools to be able to meet this demand. So the Microsoft Data Journalism program is helping press combat some of these challenges by providing guidance and training on Power BI to not only discover stories through Power BI's robust data mining, exploration capabilities, to telling those stories with interactive visualizations, the ability to publish to web. And the great thing is that Power BI is a pretty simple and easy to use tool. It doesn't require a lot of technical expertise or coding experience. It comes with a whole slew of out-of-the-box visualizations, as well as an entire community of custom visuals, Timeline Storyteller included, which we're going to demo here in a second. And all of this can be done by downloading the free Power BI desktop application and signing up for the Power BI service. So a lot of these data sets represent information over time, and Timeline Storyteller seems like it would be a really great way to communicate information around a series or sequence of events. Timeline Storyteller is really a custom visual tool that provides a robust amount of design options with capabilities for annotating, providing animated transitions, which all really kind of add to this cohesive storytelling experience, along with a range of representations, scales, and layouts to choose from. So Matthew here is part of the research team that actually created Timeline Storyteller, and he is going to kick us off by telling us a little bit about what he does at Microsoft Research and how the team came to come up with this idea.
Sure. I'm with the Storytelling with Data group at Microsoft Research, and together with my colleagues Bongshan Lee and Natalie Hunray-Riche, we try to think of new and innovative ways to present data to an audience. So these new, rich, and engaging experiences. Another angle of our work is trying to design new authoring experiences for these tools. So we're trying to make that experience be less tedious and having the ability to create these nice, rich, data-driven stories without having to resort to writing code or manually illustrating these charts. Just lowering that bar to entry.
So how did you conduct your research, and what were the learnings that you guys found?
Well, we came up with the idea for Timeline Storyteller after surveying the landscape of timeline creation tools already in existence. And what we realized after looking at them was that most of these tools out there, they adopt this single linear chronological design that really was been popular over the past 2.5 centuries. And here's one of the earliest examples of these such a timeline, where you have all the events drawn from left to right on the screen, and each event is drawn as a line. In this case, it's a lifespan of a person.
And so how did what you found in your research inform how you guys built the tool?
Well, we cataloged over 250 timeline instances and timeline creation tools that we found out there in the wild. And what we tried to do is systematically sort them, try to find some common approaches to design and identify what those design alternatives are when you're making a timeline. And we came up with this design space for timelines. And this design space is centered around 3 design choices. First, you have the representation of the timeline, which is the visual metaphor of time. Is it a linear left to right timeline, or is it like a clock face? Is it a time that repeats? Or is it a little bit of both? Is it a spiral or a calendar grid? So just those different representations are one of the design choices you have to take when designing a timeline. Another one is the time scale. Are we looking at chronological time, or are we just thinking about sequences of events without notion of how long they occur or how long that occurs between them? And finally, the third design choice we have in this design space is the layout. how do you put multiple timelines on a page or on a screen together? And that's that third dimension.
So how would you say Timeline Storyteller differs from other timeline visualization tools available today?
Well, I think it's because we put this design space front and center in the user interface and allow you access to this very rich design choices given this design space without having to resort to writing code or manually illustrating these timelines yourself. So given these choices of different representations, scales, and layouts, you can really create a wide array of different types of timelines. And when you combine that with storytelling capabilities like being able to reveal parts of a timeline, to highlight parts of a timeline, or annotate events using the scene-based design that Timeline Storyteller has, you can create a rich set of timeline stories.
It's really cool to see a tool like Power BI enable newsrooms or media organizations that might not have even teams dedicated to this or the time to build custom-built visualizations to be able to create these interactive timelines. So would you mind showing us a few examples of Timeline Storyteller?
Certainly. So my first example I want to show is a timeline story that we prepared back in June of this year during the Data Insights Summit. And back in June, this is also co-occurring with the US Open Golf Tournament. So we gathered a whole bunch of data about the US Open Golf Tournament dating back to 1895, which is when the tournament began. And what we had gathered was all of the career performances of every winner of the tournament. So in this case, we're looking at just a single winner of the US Open back in 2016. The winner was Dustin Johnson, and we're looking at his whole US Open career performance here up until that time. And in this timeline, it's drawn radially around his picture. You have his birth up in the top right. You have some events along the bottom left here, which indicate when he first made appearances at the US Open. He placed several times, and then he finally won in 2016. And this timeline story has several scenes to it. So I then, in the second scene here, identify some other interesting aspects of his data. So he placed in the top 10 several times. And then as I progress through this story, the question is, how do we compare his performance now to other previous winners of the US Open? So in this scene, I bring in another golfer. This is the guy who won several years previous to Dustin Johnson, but he was also the runner-up in 2016. So this is Jim Furyk. He won back in the early 2000s. And if we change the scale now, this is using a chronological scale currently, but if I change the scale to one that is relative to their birth, we then redraw the timeline according to this scale, and now we can make a different type of comparison, like how old they were when they first won. And as we look at it this way, despite their different age, they both won the US Open when they were in their mid-30s or so. And later in this story, I reveal more parts of this data. In this case, I bring in some of the biggest names in golf history in the next scene here. People like Tiger Woods and Arnold Palmer, and still on this common chronological, relative scale, so that we can make these types of comparisons despite the fact that they were playing at different points in history. Later in the story, I'm going to advance a few scenes here to a scene later in the story in which I am comparing all 85 of the previous winners of the US Open. And instead of drawing these radially, you'll notice here I've selected a different representation to present this data. So the question here would be, which golfer has the best US Open record?
And so what do you consider when choosing linear versus radial designs?
Well, before, when I was showing just a couple of examples radially, it worked because I was only showing a few things. You only have to make a couple of comparisons, but also the ability to annotate around the periphery of these timelines is really nice, as well as the ability to add images to the center of these timelines. So there's a few reasons for drawing those things radially earlier. But if I want to make quite a number of different comparisons, as I am here, when you have all 85 golfers, it can be handy just to scan up or down the screen here to make a common like a comparison across the same date. And when I advance this story later, it becomes even more necessary to use this linear representation, especially when we're comparing, say in this scene, the number of US Open appearances by these 7 golfers. So here it's just essentially it looks like it's a bar chart, but in this case this is just a sequential timeline for each. And so looking at it this way, we can see when into someone's career did they win after how many appearances. And similarly with this relative time scale, now that I adjust it this way, we can see the lengths of these careers. We can see how old people were when they won, and call out some interesting insights here, like the oldest golfer to have won the US Open, or someone who has won 4 times, like Jack Nicklaus here. Now, I wanted to compare this story to another story that we created around the same time. So back in June, we created this story about the history of artificial intelligence. And this story used a few different representations of time, as well as some different timescales here. So this story begins by just showing you all of the events in the timeline, but just to give a sense of what's in the story based on what categories of events we're going to care about, and just the sheer number of them. So here we have the history of artificial intelligence as it's depicted in terms of advances and setbacks, but also how artificial intelligence has been depicted in fiction, and specifically in literature and in film and television. So the story begins by just showing you everything, but then I call out just a few of these events, and this is the prospect of AI and intelligent machines and artificial thinking in fiction, going back several centuries. So now when we look at just that subset of events, we see some classic works of fiction going back to the 17th to the 18th century with Gulliver's Travels. We have Frankenstein, I, Robot, and then we can bring in some more events in the next scene to bring in, say, the depictions of AI in film and television. So we have events on here like Blade Runner, The Matrix, or Metropolis. And then later in this story, I'll jump ahead a couple scenes to when we introduce the actual history of artificial intelligence and its progress over the decades. So now we have in this timeline at the top the actual AI history, and we're calling out some of the advances and setbacks in that field. So we have the Turing test, we have the Deep Blue, we have AlphaGo, and we have also some setbacks on here, the so-called AI winter, first and second AI winter. And if we scroll down, we still have that those depictions of AI in fiction along the side to compare that, these two timelines side by side.
Very cool. So why did the team choose Power BI as the foundation for Timeline Storyteller?
We did this for a few reasons. First, Power BI has already a really huge community of users. And the next reason would be when we have Power BI has all these great data import options. So you can get data from an array of different sources into Power BI really easily. But also data export options. How do you get content out of Power BI? How do you embed things on the web? Which is a great feature that we use in the Timeline Storyteller custom visual. Right. The Power BI client already has a rich array of visualization design choices, but it didn't have anything specific to timelines yet, especially in this scene-based timeline reveal that we have in Timeline Storyteller. So we took advantage of Power BI's custom visual integration, which is this great ability to make something custom and integrate it into the Power BI ecosystem. And this custom visual marketplace is where we put Timeline Storyteller so that now everyone can use it within Power BI.
So if I'm a data journalist and I want to put together a story that's based on a timeline, what does this mean for me now?
Well, I think a timeline is a great way to get your reader familiar with the background context of any story. And Timeline Storyteller, in that you can reveal multiple timelines side by side, it's a great way to draw comparisons. You can draw comparisons yourself by highlighting things with annotation and captions, but you can also allow the reader to draw their own comparisons by placing these timelines side by side on the page.
So what kind of guidance could you share with folks as they start considering the design space for this?
This design space is really large, but I think there is some handy things you can remember when you consider the type of events that you have in your timeline. If you have events that have some recurrence to them, some periodicity or some regular occurrence, natural cycles come to mind, like weather cycles, for instance, or divergences from those cycles if those weather cycles are differing. You can choose these radial representations, which tend to accentuate these patterns. Another thing that Timeline Storyteller allows people to do is to reveal events in a non-chronological way. Mm-hmm. Some of the other timeline tools that we encountered out there, they really start from the first event and then they move to the next event and then the event after that. But we thought that's not really how people tell stories. I might start with the most important event, and then I might reveal events that give more context that may have occurred before or after or at the same time. So you can reveal a story in a number of different ways. It doesn't have to be purely chronological. And given Timeline Storyteller's scene-based reveal, you can do that.
Awesome. And so if you were to sum this up, what would you say are the most noteworthy features of Timeline Storyteller?
Well, I would say this big palette of design options that this design space gives you within Timeline Storyteller is the big selling point of this. Because before that, you would have had to resort to writing your own code or drawing this in illustration software, and then you would lose the interactivity there. I think another big selling point of Timeline Storyteller is the ability to annotate the canvas with captions, or to click on an event and annotate it, or to add some rich imagery to a scene. And finally, to be able to record these story points as a series of scenes and then export it and embed it in a blog or a website.
Yeah. So why don't you take us through from start to finish now a demonstration of how somebody would go about using Power BI and the Timeline Storyteller custom visual?
Sure. All right. So what we're going to need for this, the story that I'm going to create is data, Power BI, and the Timeline Storyteller plugin for Power BI. So I already have Power BI Desktop installed on my machine here. And what I'm going to need is the data that we're going to use today. So the data I want to look at today is data about eclipses. So last week here in North America, many of us were fortunate to catch a full solar eclipse that took place. But if you missed it, you may be wondering, well, when's the next one? And where should I see it? So what I have here is a Excel spreadsheet that I'm going to use for my demo. It has the dates of every solar eclipse, according to Wikipedia at least, that'll take place in the 21st century. I also have the type of eclipse, be it a total, annular, or hybrid, or partial eclipse. I also have location data for these eclipses. I'm not going to use the precise geocoded coordinates, but I'm going to use the region of the world in which the eclipse is going to take place. So that's either an ocean or a continent. And finally, I have a field in which has a richer text annotation that I'm going to reveal in Timeline Storyteller, which has the date and the precise location of these eclipses. So now that I have my spreadsheet full of event data, I'm going to load this into Power BI. So I'll just click Get Data, and I'll import from Excel. I'll hit Connect. Select my eclipses data. And I have my one sheet there in my Eclipse spreadsheet that has all the data listed here. So I'm going to load this. And once it loads, it takes a few seconds, I'll see it in my Fields section on the side panel here in Power BI. So here we have it here. So the next thing I'll need is the Timeline Storyteller custom visual. So in order to load that into Power BI, I can click this ellipse button here in the Visualizations panel. Because Power BI is a custom visual, I have to import it from the Office Store. And this will reveal this dialog for loading custom visuals. And I'll just search for Storyteller. And I'll add it to Power BI. And it'll tell me that it was successfully imported. And so as you see here now, we have this Timeline Storyteller visual in the interface. So it just got added to my canvas, and I'm going to expand this to be the full size of my canvas for now. Also hide this ribbon so I can have more space to work. So when I loaded the Timeline Storyteller visual into the canvas here, you'll notice that I have several fields to work with here. So I have the start and end dates of events in my data. I have categorical information, as well as another categorical field, which I call facet, and I'll reveal what that means in just a moment. And also content text, which is the text that gets revealed in annotations in Timeline Storyteller. So the first thing I'm going to grab is the date field from my spreadsheet and drag it into the start date field. And this will draw all of the eclipse of data that I had in that spreadsheet on a common linear chronological timeline. So we have now in the UI of Timeline Storyteller, you see that there's representation choices along the top, scale and layout choices. Not all the configurations are possible given what you've already selected. So now that I have all the events on my timeline, it's not that informative yet. I don't know anything about the types of eclipses. I also don't know where they occur in the world. And when I mouse over any of these eclipses, I only get date information. So I'm going to load some more data fields into this panel here. I don't need end date today because all of these eclipses take place only on one day and over the course of only a few minutes in some cases. But if I had events that had longer spans of in time, I would also need this date field. But I'm not going to use this for this demo. So the first thing I'm going to add to this data set is the type. And I'm going to drag this field into the category field here. And now that timeline gets redrawn, and I see I have now color-coded events that indicate what type of eclipse that was. So I'll still need a few more things before I'm ready to start making this into a story, because I still don't have the text that describes the event or the world region, which I'll bring in next. So I'm going to drag the world region that the eclipse is going to occur in into this field called facet. And now you'll notice before this faceted layout was grayed out, now it is active. I can actually select this, and this will use that facet field to split this into multiple timelines. So I'll just move the legend for now over here, just so that you get a sense of which each of these timelines are about. And currently they're listed here in alphabetical order. So we have Africa, the solar eclipse is occurring there, and all of the other world regions in my data. The last thing I'll need before I get started recording this as a story is the text. And that's the text that gets revealed on mouse over. Right now it's just showing me the region. So I want the more verbose text that I had in my data set, and I'll drag that to the context text field. So now I have everything that I need to create this story. As you see now, if I mouse over any of these events, it gives me that rich text annotation from my data. Now, one thing I wanted to change before I record any scenes in this story is I don't like the color choices that it did automatically. I'm going to, because for me at least, total eclipses evoke darkness, I want a totally black color choice here. And because the brown color of hybrids is pretty close to that, I'm going to select a bluer color for that. Maybe a bit too bright. Okay. There we go. So now that I'm happy with my color choices, I'm going to start recording this as a story. And the first thing I'm going to do is, in my first scene of my story, is I want to just show the sequence of these eclipses, just to give a sense of a scale of how many eclipses there are going to occur in this century. So I'm going to select a spiral representation that is just sequential in scale. So there's no notion of chronology yet, just this is the sequence of eclipses going to occur in the 21st century. I'm going to position my legend over here, and I'm going to add a caption to this scene. And just to speed this up, I have some captions already saved from in this text article here, so I'm going to copy and paste from these captions. So my first scene is, by the end of the 21st century, the world will witness 224 solar eclipses. And this caption by default gets added to the middle of this canvas, but I can position it and resize it however I like. And now that I'm happy with the first scene of my story, I'm going to record this. And as you see here, this scene gets saved as a little thumbnail down in the bottom of Timeline Storyteller. So for my second scene, I want to now reveal to the viewer when these eclipses are going to take place. And so for that, I'm going to select a radial representation. And initially, this is still drawn on a sequential scale, so all of these events are still holding that same sequence. But there's still no notion here about when these events occur. It's just a sequence. So for that, I need to select a chronological scale. And this will now redraw the timeline along a chronological scale. So now all these events are placed according to where they belong on this timeline. And in this scene, I want to add a little bit more richer annotation to this scene. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to first highlight the eclipse that just occurred in North America, which was the eclipse on August 21st. And I'm going to position this annotation just off to the side here. And I want to also bring in an image to this scene. So I'm going to choose a file from my own machine to annotate this timeline. And I'm going to select this nice eclipse image that I found, or And this image I'm just going to place in the middle of my timeline here. And I can resize the image and place it wherever I want. And like in the first scene, I'm going to add a caption for the viewer here, asking the viewer, well, did you miss the August 21st eclipse? And when and where can you catch the next one? So I'm going to position this just over to the side here, and I'm going to record this now. I'm happy with this scene as my second scene in my story. All right. So my third scene, I want to draw attention to the fact that these eclipses are fairly predictable and regular in their occurrences. So I'm going to select a new layout, and this is a segmented layout. So I haven't talked about this yet, but a segmented layout breaks up a single timeline into multiple timelines based on a smaller granularity of time. So we were looking at an entire century before in the single timeline. Now this is broken up into a timeline for each decade. And one thing you'll notice just by scanning this is that these solar eclipses, they occur pretty regularly with a pretty even frequency here. So I'm going to draw the viewer's attention to this with a caption to that effect. I'll position this caption, and I'm pretty happy with this scene. I'll actually just indicate on here first when the next big solar eclipse in North America is, which is in 2024, and I'll position this caption right there. And then I've just recorded this as the third scene of my story. And my next scene, I want to transition to focus on where in the world these eclipses are going to take place. But I'm going to need a little transition scene before I do that to bring it back to a single timeline and then break it up into the different world regions. So I'm going to return to a single unified timeline. I'll reposition my legend just off to the side here, and I'll add yet another caption for this scene. And I'll record this as my scene here. And now I'm going to split this into the different world regions in which these eclipses take place. So in order to do that, I'll select a faceted layout here. And this is, again, using that this field here, this region facet field, which will create a separate timeline for each facet. So now we have the different world regions, each get their own timeline spanning the 100-year span. So one thing you'll notice here as I scan these different world regions is that there seems to be a lot of partial eclipses near the poles of the Antarctic Ocean. Here you see a lot of red events. And similarly for North America, you have quite a few there too. So I'm going to call attention to this with a new caption that near the poles there are many partial eclipses. Again, I'll just position this caption up near the top. Now that I'm happy with my scene, I'll record it, and this gets added down to my scene tray again. So a few more scenes I want to call attention to. The next thing I want to do is highlight just the places on land that you can see total solar eclipses from. And so I don't care about the partial eclipses or the eclipses that are only visible from the ocean. So in order to call attention to that, I'm going to open up this filter panel here. And in the filter panel, I can select the types of eclipses. So I have a category filter, I have a facet filter, and a segment filter. I'm going to leave the segment filter alone because I want to look at the entire century and not by decade. But I will use the facet filter and the category filter. So for the facet filter, I'm going to select just the continents, and I can do a control selection here. So I'll select just the continents. And in my category filter, I'm going to select the annular, hybrid, not partial, and not all. So as you notice, there was some effect here in my timeline. Some of the events are now drawn with not full opacity anymore, but they're still there, But that's because I am emphasizing the events that meet this filter criteria. So these types of eclipses in these world regions. But as you notice, there are two filtering modes in Timeline Storyteller. Right now we're using a filtering mode called Emphasize. And I'm going to use the Hide filter mode, which is going to remove these from other events that don't meet these filter criteria from the canvas. So the result of that is now I only have timelines for these regions, these faceted regions by land, and events that meet that criteria. So no partial eclipses are drawn anymore. And in this scene, I'm also going to add just a caption to draw the viewer's attention to just that filtered data. So I'll add this caption, position it up here. Record this as a scene. And then in my last scene, what I want to do is call attention to the world region that has the most total solar eclipses visible from land. So I'm going to, for this comparison, I'm going to select a different representation as well as a different scale. What I want to do is just illustrate how many eclipses occur in each of these world regions. So I'm going to select a linear representation for this data. So here they're still drawn on a chronological scale, so it's difficult just by counting here to get a sense of how many eclipses take place in these different regions. So I'm going to select a sequential scale, and this will redraw these timelines, just the sequence, so I no longer have the chronological distance between these events. Now I'll reposition this legend so that we can see it here. And I'm going to call attention to the fact that Africa sees the most eclipses of all these different world regions in the next century at least. And I'm going to draw attention to the next big eclipse, solar eclipse occurring in Africa, which I believe is in 2027. This one here. And thanks to Wikipedia, I actually have an image of the trajectory of this solar eclipse. So I'm going to add this to the scene as a nice annotation here. I have it stored as a ping image here. So this solar eclipse, you see the trajectory here, and I can position this image over top of my timelines, but still leave some room so that those timelines and the annotation that I drew earlier are still visible. And finally, I'm going to add a caption to the scene, just illustrating this point. All right. And finally, I record that scene in my story. So now that I'm happy with my story, let's say I want to take these 7 scenes now and export this content so that I can see it elsewhere on the web. You'll notice that this button here, this playback mode, I can view this story within Power BI without the full Timeline Storyteller user interface, and this will just advance me through the recorded scenes that I've made. And this is the viewing experience that you'll see elsewhere once this is published. I'll go back to the first scene here. So a few steps to take before this can be published on the web. One thing I'm going to do is open the format panel for the Timeline Storyteller visual. You see that there's an option here for story. I'm going to select auto load here, which will auto load the playback mode of Timeline Storyteller. And the next thing I'm going to do is save this. This is currently an untitled, so I'm going to save this as 21st century eclipses. And my next step is to export this to Power BI in the web. So I can publish this report in Power BI just by hitting the publish and publish to Power BI, and I need to select a destination. So I have a Timeline Storyteller account that I have up on Power BI, so that's the folder that I'm going to publish to. And it takes a few moments, and it'll let you know and give you a link when it's ready, when it's published this report to the web. And there we have it. So I'm going to open this now in Power BI in the web. So as you see here, the first scene of my Eclipse story is now visible here in the web, and it has the minimal UI. One more thing I need to do is to publish to web from Power BI, so that will generate a link and as well as an embed code to put this into a blog post or a website. So I'll hit that embed code and publish. And I have a couple options here. Once I've selected publish, I can share this link to this story that I've made, or I can embed this using this iframe by cutting and pasting it into my website. So now I've copied this link. Let's open this up in a new tab, and this will be what it looks like in the web for your viewers. All right, so there's my first scene, and now I can advance into the rest of my story. And at any time, I should point out that even your viewers can break out of this story mode. If they want, they can explore this data themselves, and they can change the scales of representation. And then at any point, they can navigate to a different scene in the story. So if I wanted to jump to scene 5, for instance, I can then go right there, and I can, at any time, select these different representations, scales, or layout, even as a viewer taking in this story.
Thank you, Matthew, for that demo. I don't know about you, but I am super excited for 2024.
Well, but in the meantime, we don't need these because we can look directly at these timelines.
Okay, well, in all seriousness, thank you, Matthew, for that demonstration. Timeline Storyteller seems like it really opens the door to a lot of opportunities for representing this concept of time in new and creative ways, both with just the robust design choices as well as the ability to annotate, as we saw, or create flashbacks or scene sequences. I'm going to throw some resources up on the screen, and these will really help you get started with Power BI and download the Timeline Storyteller custom visual. Encourage you guys to start playing around with those and then join the conversation with the Power BI community. So it's a great place to ask questions as well as share your experiences with a community of fellow data lovers. And you're always welcome to reach out to the Microsoft Data Journalism team as well. The alias is on the screen. In the meantime, we want to thank you for your time. We look forward to seeing your timeline stories.
Thanks.